Noah built the ark out of gopher wood. The flood it came and the ark it stood. And Noah's ark's a moving, a moving, a moving. And Noah's ark's a moving, a moving along. Who built the ark? Oh, Noah, Noah. Now who built the ark? Oh, Noah, my Lord. Noah's ark's a moving, a moving, a moving. Noah's ark's a moving along. He marched the animals 2 by 2.
I'm Bob Crawford.
And I'm Chris Breslin.
And this is RTN Theology number 29. And Chris, as you just told me a minute ago, Stanley Hauerwas says that best is not a theological category. Somehow I want to say this is our best episode yet.
It's a great episode, and one of many great episodes. I was really excited to assemble just an amazing conversation with some wonderful conversation partners, one of whom you all have heard before on the show a couple times, and this is Jamie Smith's third appearance on RTN Theology. We, however, introduced a new guest, Natalie Carnes, and I knew Natalie a little bit from my time at Duke. Now she teaches at Baylor and teaches at all these amazing intersections of art and history and theology and feminism and gender studies, and it's just such an interesting writer and voice these days.
Yeah, if you look up Natalie on the internet, you're going to see a lot about iconoclasm and a lot about a lot of analysis about imagery and how our culture and our lives is shaped by the imagery that we create and the imagery that we idolize in a lot of ways. And of course, if you have James K. Smith on your program, you're probably going to talk about Augustine.
Yeah, and we talked quite a bit about Augustine because Natalie's new book is called Motherhood, A Confession, and she does this radical, beautiful refiguring of Augustine through the lens of being a mother herself. And obviously neither Bob nor I nor Jamie are mothers, and so we really benefited from her take and her perspective. But as I think Jamie mentions in the conversation, it's just such a beautiful, faithful deconstruction and really constructive project to talk about some of the things that Augustine was talking about in a woman's voice, and thinking about things like desire and justice and just relating to the people that are close to you, all in front of God and with God and related to God. It's awesome. It's one of the best books I've read in the last 12 months for sure.
Something evident in Natalie's work and in her book that, of course, didn't come out this week, didn't come out last week, but in the book she speaks about issues and events that have become front of mind for us today. So she saw them and she lived them and she experienced them in a certain way. But now we're all seeing them and we're all living them and we're all experiencing them. And that just goes to show, we talk about creating imagery and iconoclasm. Well, that just shows you that theologians, historians, artists, pastors, by the time something makes the news, it's already seeped into the culture and spread. And there are some people that are attuned to what is happening in the moment, and they can interpret it as it's happening.
I think that's right. I think that's the miracle of making anything, especially like scholarly work that takes so long and goes through so many editing processes and peer review and all this stuff. But even a song or some of these ways that we're making art that you can make it in your bedroom and broadcast it out to millions of people the next day. But is the idea of artists and thinkers and creators getting ahead of where everyone else is. They're always ahead of us, right? And I think the other miracle is that these creators are making things that are evergreen and enduring, but also just completely tuned in to the moment, in like the specific moment. And I think that came through. As we mentioned in the conversation, I read her chapter on justice the week after George Floyd's death, and it was as if it was written that day. It was unbelievable. And there, there was some mentions of iconoclasm and bringing down monuments, and it's turn on the news. This is like Karl Barth is supposed to have said that preachers should have the Bible in one hand and the New York Times in the other. And that's exactly what it feels like in this conversation with Natalie and with Jamie.
Bless the Lord, oh my soul, all that is within me, bless his name. He forgives all our sin. He is slow to anger, full of grace. As high as heavens are up above, so is the greatness of his love. As far as the east is from the west, he removes our sin from us. Far as the east is from the west, far as the east is from the west.
We have great ingredients of a joke here. We have like a Pentecostal postmodernist philosopher sitting down, with a feminist patristic scholar who's married to a Catholic at a Baptist university, and a professional musician.
Walk into a bar.
Yeah. Well, there's no bars right now, right? Yeah.
That's right. It's true.
But
or drinking.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, day drinking, but no bars. I guess I'm curious what I see in common and why we invited Natalie Carnes and Jamie Smith to join us today on this episode of Road to Now Theology is Augustine. Both of you have written amazing books. Some of probably my favorite two things I've read in the last 12 months. Jamie, you wrote like a travelogue, and I'm probably going to offend you guys with this description of each of your books, like a travelogue / theological self-help book. And Natalie, you've written this like parenting book memoir that's not at all a parenting book, how most people would understand it. I guess I'd be curious, why Augustine for these really interesting aims and directions you guys have taken? Like, why and how Augustine?
I'm most interested in Natalie's answer because I think there's a lot more surprise in some ways, or there's a lot more reasons for her to not.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the introduction, Chris, and I appreciate the question marks with which you introduced my book. It's a parenting book, question mark, because I guess it is kind of hard to put a genre exactly to it. But I teach Augustine every semester to my introduction to theology students, and I teach it because I find it's a beautiful book. I love reading it. And it's also a book that has sort of dominated the Western tradition. I mean, it's a book that is one of the most read books in Western literary history. So it's a book that it's difficult to stay away from as a theologian. And it's a book that I have a kind of profound ambivalence about, that I deeply love, and I also have deep misgivings about it. And I think the way that feminist theologians have most often engaged Augustine's Confessions is either by not engaging it, so avoiding it, and starting new conversations in theology, which has been really important to feminist theology, establishing more generative conversations for women and other sexually marginalized individuals. And then the other mode has been critique, which is sort of exposing the structures of domination and patriarchy that infect. And that's been really important strategy also for us to make visible the ways that this text has things in it we don't want to replicate. But both of those two strategies end up making feminist theologians outsiders to the mainstreams of Christian theology. And so I was also interested in the question of, how do I receive Augustine's Confessions and engage it as a feminist theologian and as my text, a text that addresses me? And so that's sort of the experiment that I'm trying to play with in Motherhood.
Which is just an incredible book, by the way. I mean, I think the conception of it is so remarkable. That's why I'm really intrigued. I think you're doing, it's subversive, but in a way that is constructive and creative and unpredictable, and is still a work that is part of the tradition and faith in which Augustine and you locate yourselves. Do you know what I mean? So I see it as such a faithful deconstruction in a way. That's why I was blown away by the book, by the way. I just want to make sure that we're on the record.
Yeah. Jamie, when we talked to you, you talked about Augustine as kind of having this emigre faith that, and even in his ethnicity, which often gets blurred in representations of him. He's a North African in between worlds, right?
Yes, yeah.
And so I was kind of joking with the introduction for y'all, but in some ways, both of you are a little in between like worlds, and at the very least, in where you're teaching and what your projects are. I'd just be curious, like.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it's also interesting. I don't know if Natalie sees this herself, but what's so interesting about Motherhood is it's not just an academic book in a typical sense either. And clearly you took the craft of writing seriously, so there's a literary endeavor. And I think we were both trying to write books that are informed by our scholarly expertise and theological and philosophical expertise, but also realize that there's something at stake for wider audiences. So it's almost like the genre. The reason why the books don't fit on a shelf very predictably is because we're trying to inhabit that between space. I mean, it's interesting. I would say it's obviously, I think it's more predictable and, to be honest, easier for all the wrong reasons for male philosopher to come to Augustine. Do you know what I mean? It's just part of the canon, and so it's very, very straightforward. What's interesting is, I came back to Augustine through 20th century German, French philosophy and phenomenology, but I would say, without question, the book that most broke open Augustine for me anew was Hannah Arendt's dissertation, Love and St. Augustine, which was just this. I mean, it's almost like you felt like you hadn't read the same book before when you came back to Augustine with those eyes. And so it was also that made me appreciate just the enduring sort of perennial nature of Augustine's questions, which is why I think we keep revisiting him and encountering him in that way.
What was it about Arendt? Because when that book was first mentioned to me when I was in graduate school, I remember someone saying, well, this is Arendt. It's probably her worst book. She gets Augustine completely wrong.
So what and it's funny, the thing that intrigued me about what Arendt was doing was, and this will sound really weird, but she was actually kind of setting aside the theology, which sounds like a recipe for like a terrible, terrible reading of Augustine. But what I think it did is she just wanted to she wanted to hear Augustine as, I would say, a phenomenologist of human consciousness. Do you know what I mean? So in that sense, I felt like she was taking him seriously. Now, I don't think you can sift out his theology from his take on the human person. But the fact that she tried to meant she didn't get sort of bogged down in just being angry about the dogma. She sort of read him as this psychologist of the human heart, or grappling with friendship. I think probably people who are frustrated by it have a legitimate criticism of whether or not she fully appreciates his account of intersubjectivity. But what to me, it was almost like, by not reading him as a Christian theologian, opened him up as a peer and a contemporary in a sense. Like, I don't know if that makes much sense, but that was what I remember. This is like the mid 90s, you know, I was in grad school at the time. And it was also a big surprise that somebody like Arendt had cut teeth on Augustine. To me, and I think to a lot of us, we were like, oh, we had no idea this was the backstory. So that was really another example of how Augustine sort of showed up in the most surprising places.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, Natalie. I read an article that you wrote, I guess, after this book was published, and you speak of being an academic and in a classroom and asking imploring your students to only use the word I when you say I argue, right? In that part of your paper, I argue. That's academic writing. However, you write this memoir, and Jamie, you got to respond to this as well. The idea of taking that, you know, it's like the disembodied I is the way you put it, Natalie. How did you put yourself in the Confessions?
Thanks, Bob. Well, to be clear, I'm having to convince my students to use I because they've learned all of these anxieties about saying the word I as if it's a bad word in academic writing. So I'm telling them, no, you can say I, but like, we don't want to know that much about you in this paper. We want to know what you're arguing. That's the I that we're concerned about. But to engage a work like Augustine's Confessions, of course, the I argue that is completely bound up with, and I desired this, and I betrayed this, and a whole sort of history of another kind of an I. And so I think for me, I just taught this book for you know, I have been teaching this book for a decade now almost. And I always have this kind of like conversation with Augustine. Like, you know, he has like one of his most famously like difficult to swallow scenes now is him like looking at an infant who's like greedily nursing, refusing to share his nurse or mother. And that for Augustine is a picture of original sin. And I think to read that as, you know, a modern reader is just to be like, oh, come on, Augustine, really? A nursing infant, that's your picture of original sin. It just doesn't take hold in the same way. And so anyway, just through having this conversation with Augustine in my head, I guess as I've been teaching it over the years, it sort of helped me eventually imagine myself into the story. And the thing that I'm trying to explore in that article that you're mentioning from LitHub is the way that conversation becomes my attempt at repairing Augustine's Confessions, which I see as a text most fundamentally about the difficulty of receiving the good gifts of God well. And that there's a gift that Augustine hasn't yet learned how to receive well, and that's the gift of female flesh. Female flesh is from the very beginning, from that episode of the wrong attachment of the babies to the breast of the mother, is figured as a problem, as an occasion of sin, and a site of sinfulness throughout the Confessions. I mean, the pair theft is like the paradigmatic sin, but even the pair theft, what it really comes down to for Augustine is he's not submitting to law in the pair theft. But the law that really bothers him is not the law about property. It's not really about thieving. The law that he hasn't submitted to is the law against lust. And so female flesh is the problem throughout the Confessions. And I feel, you know, my response to Augustine is to try to help him receive the goodness of female flesh. And that's in helping Augustine to receive this gift, then the text begins to speak back to me and my own sinfulness, which becomes a wrong kind of attachment to myself. In the first chapter, exploring like a wrong kind of attachment to myself as the nursing mother. And that's like a wrong kind of attachment, not because the body is problematic or bad, or it's because it's so good. It's because lactation, the ability to give life from your very body to another, is such a powerful image of God that, like all the best gifts, it can also become a site of idolatry and temptation. So it's through imagining myself and being willing to risk this conversation with this amazing misogynistic person, that the text is able to speak to me and I'm able to speak back to the text in a way that I hope is generative.
One of the things that I think you perform that is so in the spirit of the Confessions is actually a similar vulnerability. So it's critical without being defensive, which I think is a very, very difficult posture to achieve. And so I really admired that your capacity to be able to do in the writing. And when I think of your classroom, that was one of my first thoughts. I was probably only a chapter into the book, the manuscript, and I thought this would give half of my classroom Augustine back in a serious way, right? Because I also teach Augustine every semester, and so yeah, it's a remarkable gift in that regard.
We long for Egypt in the wilderness, a kingdom made of dust. Built an idol out of happiness, a paradise of rust. We lost all the meaning, drowned out the feeling, our hearts barely beating. Restore us again, God of our salvation, revive us again in your unfailing love. Restore us again, God of our salvation, revive us again in your unfailing love. We have trusted in the meaningless and chased a life of ease. Now we wander in the shadowlands, where comfort is our king. We lost all the meaning, drowned out the feeling, our hearts barely beating. Restore us again, God of our salvation, revive us again in your unfailing love. Restore us again, God of our salvation, revive us again in your unfailing love.
Some of our listeners might not be as familiar with Augustine or Confessions, and so you mentioned the pear theft, which is like this key moment, maybe alongside the Colosseum, or like in my mind, like the two big moments. It almost plays like a movie. Maybe retell that story a little, and then I'd love to kind of dig into some of the ways that kind of gets reconfigured or taken up in your story as well.
Yeah, so Augustine's pear theft is sort of his retelling of a fall story of the Garden of Eden, where the forbidden fruit is the pear. It's forbidden because it's someone else's property in this story. And Augustine tells this story where he thieves these pears, and he's trying to ponder, like, why did I do this? And he's like, the pears weren't even that good. They weren't, like, I had access to better fruits. And part of the story is that he's with this sort of gang of friends who goad him into doing it, or that sort of he feels the pressure of those friendships, but that's not enough to really account for it. And so he goes through this sort of exploration where every sin has to be the pursuit of something good. Even the worst person he can imagine is still, he can narrate it as the false pursuit of something good in his sin. So he's like, what is the good here? What am I pursuing? And what he eventually comes to is a description of all sin as a perverse imitation of God. He goes through all these different sins and what they're perversely imitating. So how does that apply to the theft of the pear? Well, it's a perverse imitation of God's liberty, because in the way that God is subject to no law, because God is the law, So Augustine, the young Augustine, is trying to perversely imitate that liberty by showing himself to not be subject to this law, the law of property in this case. So that's what I see as the major moves of that. But I'm curious if Jamie has would add something or change something about what I.
No, I mean, I think it would be resonant. I think what always struck me in that episode too is, right, you've got the use enjoyment distinction. So for Augustine, rightly ordered love is just another sort of angle on thinking about the perversion of sin. And so for love to be rightly ordered is for me to sort of receive the gifts for what they are, and I use them to ultimately enjoy God. Disordered love is when I cling to the gifts and enjoy them instead of God. And so what's interesting is at the end of that pear tree incident is he says, yeah, we basically took a bite and threw them away. So it's not even like we were enjoying the fruit, but we were, in a sense, enjoying the thrill of enjoying what we should have been using. There's this reflexive swirling eddy of the disorder of love. And I think that's, and by the way, that's probably one of the first things that Hannah Arendt showed me. It might be dumb that it took me that long to see it, but that I would say is that reading of sin on that sort of register was a big gift from Arendt.
And a lot of his descriptions of sin are the different inversions of the creator-creation relationship. I mean, in book 1, it's peeling apart creation from creator. In book 2, it's the creation wrongly playing creator. But part of what I'm interested in is it's not that I disagree with that description of sin exactly, is that I think it potentially conscripts imitation into a purely kind of negative valence. And I'm interested in recovering the ways, well, yes, imitation can go awry, right? But imitating what is beyond us as humans is constitutive of our humanity, in that you can look at little babies and little toddlers even more so, that they're constantly, the way that they learn to be human is by imitating what's beyond them and trying to discern what is it they're supposed to imitate about being human and what is it that they're not supposed to imitate about being an adult is sort of part of their learning process. And I think for us humans too, we actually are called to imitate God, right? Imitatio Christi is sort of at the core of the Christian tradition, but we don't imitate all parts of being God. And when we do, that gets us into trouble. And so I think Augustine is right in his sort of fascinating descriptions of his headlong rush into nothingness and in the inversion of the creator-creation relationship. And yet I think it's important to keep beside that story another story about how it is imitation is crucial to our humanity.
Lest all this sounds very like lofty and above the ground, I had the benefit of reading, especially reading the suffering chapter a couple days after George Floyd, and it, as you can imagine, like you speak quite a bit in that chapter about the ways that you want to expose and not to expose your daughter to suffering, and exactly related to the suffering of Black people and historically and currently in Waco, where you guys are at. I can't help but also see a couple confluences when you're talking about the pear incident with the kind of the traditional take, or Augustine's take, about how that's a violation of property, and the ways property plays into transgression. We've seen this recent spate of Black deaths mostly related to like insanely inane property, suspicions of property abuse.
Right.
Like Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd is about a job site and a $20 bill, and then also the like perversion of imitation in terms of like the vigilante like lynch mob, like enacting some sort of justice that is beyond imitation in a ghastly way, so I guess I would love for you to talk more about that suffering chapter, because I found it one of the best chapters of the book, and as a I'm a parent of 4 small kids, and our youngest is Black, and so these are very much on my mind about exposure and protection and all of those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my experience of introduction into parenthood was I thought it would be like, I'm so proud I've created this thing. That's what I thought parenthood was. And then I had this baby and I was just like overwhelmed by its difference from me, her difference from me. And also it's her dependence upon me. Like my first reaction was just being overwhelmed by the way that this small little life was utterly dependent upon me. And that called forth from me this mercy. And I think that that's like parenthood is this invitation, this sort of shove into this new life of mercy. But that mercy can go multiple ways, right? Then that mercy can then open you in to the suffering heart of the world. And I think most parents experience something like this when the first time you start listening to news stories after you've become a parent.
Yeah.
They hit you in a different way, right? I've talked to so many mothers and recently fathers too, who find themselves crying at news stories that they before would listen to and be sad, but it didn't hit you or cut you in the same way. So it can take you into the suffering heart of the world, and it can also take you into this mode of, well, I've got to protect this little thing at all costs. And the desire to protect and show mercy for your little one becomes an excuse and a cover to cut yourself off from the suffering of the world. So it's a mercy that can become, it's a love that funds its own destruction in this very perverse way. And I think the thing we as parents is that we are, as Christian parents, called into the suffering heart of the world. And yet that doesn't mean that we sort of, throw our babies into, throw away all of our responsibilities, abdicate responsibilities to protect this particular child, or that we don't have a particular responsibility to this child that we're given. And the difficult thing about parenthood is that you don't ever settle that once and for all, right? That at each stage, you're called to different forms of exposure of yourself and your child. What you do for a child at 2 and what you do for a child at 12 are 2 different things. And in this time in particular, when we're seeing the ways that, white parents wanting to protect their children has become a cover for exposing the children of Black parents, it calls for a serious reevaluation of what are we doing with our schools? What are we doing with our public health funding? What are we doing with the ways that we participate in a society that privileges some children and neglects and abdicates responsibility for others? So I wish I had like a formula that I could be like, this is what we have to do, but I think the difficulty and challenge of parenthood is that we're constantly called both to protect and love and care for this little child and open that child up to the suffering heart of the world.
Yeah. It's not that sort of parenting book.
It's not that sort of parenting book. No.
I'd be curious. You shift throughout the book as your daughter, and your daughter is like a metonymic for all of your daughters, right? Like kind of you shift towards like the letting go as they age, which is a different sort of, you describe motherhood repeatedly as like a dividedness or a two-ness. And I'd be curious, Jamie, like you're in a very different phase than everyone here with small children who are experiencing pandemic as like very hands-on and very oneness. But you've recently like, you've married off a child. Another
one this summer.
Another one. So you're in this two-ness moment. I'd just be interested in
although it did strike me. Yeah. I mean, everything, this is so much of the insight of Natalie's book into the sort of the exposure of parenthood. I don't know if this will be frustrating or bad news for all of you, but it never goes away. It never goes away. You know, like my daughter who got married last summer, she's 23, just bought a motorcycle. And we're like, it's an interesting, but it just strikes me that, so we're also trying to parent Christianly. And because of everything that Natalie said, what you're also actually trying to do is parent them to become the kinds of people who are actually willing to be exposed and take risks and be vulnerable for the sake of others. I mean, if we go back to the imitation claim, I think what's so disgusting about American is, wasn't it W who described, you know, the ownership society? Like, what makes us American is that we have stuff, right? And then the greatest threat is that somebody will take my stuff, and then we literally kill people because you might take my stuff. It's insane. It's the most disordered form of sovereignty, really, if you think of it in that sense. And so that's perverse imitation of a kind of almightiness. And yet what we're really called to imitate is cruciform risk and exposure and giving ourselves away. And obviously, you know, I'm a parent of white kids, and it's a qualitatively different game. And yet we've had a lot of conversations over the past 2 months where we've been really, our kids are spread out now. And yet my son and his wife who live in Brooklyn are every day on the streets trying to defund the police. And we're sort of learning from their trying to live into, what does it mean? What do we all have to give up actually for equity and inclusion and justice to happen here? And to parent children into embracing their own risk and exposure and sacrifice. Nobody gave us that book.
and this is a parallel family that you pick up the narrative of Macrina alongside Macrina and her mother alongside of Augustine and Saint Monica, and you use this inversion that the child becomes the parent. It sounds like that's a little bit of what's happening.
Yeah, very much, yeah.
When your fear comes marching like an army, and you hear all the pounding of the drums, when your cries for justice come up empty, when you ask in weakness, Lord, how long? When they sing with their creeds and confessions, with blinded eyes and hearts of stone, when they paid no heed to your oppression, I will never leave you there alone. No, I will never leave you 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 alone.
In that suffering chapter, which I was reading this morning, and on the verge of tears, it's so beautiful and so relevant. And that's what I wrote here in my notes. It's just how relevant it is to this moment, and the idea that we, first of all, you give this. I'm going to paraphrase this James Baldwin quote that you put in the book. White children, rich or poor, grow up with a diluted grasp of reality. And we're in a moment here where, you know, I know that Chris and I, and probably you, Natalie, we're in this pandemic, So we're trying to control how our children are reacting to it, right? And how our lives have all changed so dramatically. And so we're used to trying to, like, how much suffering am I going to let in for my child? How much suffering am I going to, shield them from? But now we're in a situation where we as adults are also in uncharted territory. So, we're taking in all this suffering, and we really can't shield our children too much because they know what's up.
Right.
Everything's different.
Right.
And so that's very relevant to this book.
Yeah.
And then also, you talk about the paradox for your daughters of, on the one hand, they're white, so they're in the power center, but yet they're female, so they're known to be weak, right? In a cultural sense. And then finally, and I'm just going to get all this in at the same time because I think it's all of a piece. You talk about you open the chapter, your daughter performs in a play, and it's off the wall, and everybody's just so excited, and she's so excited, and then you find her in her closet or up in her room crying, and it's this idea of that. Like, my son's 9, and it's the idea of the reality comes in that joy and sorrow are just the other side of the coin, right? And it reminded me of a few things. First, Scott Avett, 19 years we've been together in this band, and he would always say, we'd be having a great time, and he would say, not mournfully, but just knowingly in a sense, or morbidly in a sense, that man, this is never going to happen again. Whatever moment it was, no matter how good it was, I'm so sad right now.
Yeah.
I got a little tear dot in my eye because this will never happen again. Right. And every year we kind of have a tour schedule, and when we play that last show of the year, I always say, and I know we're going to have 2 or 3 months off before we see each other again proper. I say to myself in my head on stage, will this happen again? Is this it? Is somebody going to get sick? Somebody going to die? Will there be tragedy? Will something prevent us from going on? And I always have this immense, take this in. This is beautiful. This could be it. And it's funny how we kind of have reached that moment in the moment we're in. So all that to say that you really capture so much of this, what Jamie called, or what somebody said earlier, between space, this between space that we all live in, this between joy and sorrow, to be a white, privileged individual in the United States of America. We do not live in this reality. So anyway, I know that's all just kind of, again, rambling, because you've all spoke so beautifully and eloquently today, and I've gotten so much out of this conversation so far. But can you, Natalie, kind of address for yourself the relevance, now, today, obviously you talk about Black motherhood in this book, and how it's just a life of mourning, right? You didn't write this book yesterday. You didn't write this book a week ago. No. You wrote this book, at least, this book has been in the works for years, right? So that tells me that the tragedy of Black America, it didn't happen with George Floyd's death, right? We all know that. Right. So what does it mean for you right now, today, to revisit this chapter on suffering, with the fact that we're culturally aware, the nation is aware, 72% of Americans, see the injustice. Yeah.
Right. I mean, was it 2016 that Philando Castile was shot, and with his 4-year-old daughter in the backseat of his car? Why that wasn't the awakening to America's consciousness of the suffering of Black lives and the violence against Black bodies, I don't know. But I know that right now the awareness has lasted longer and the attention has been more sustained than at any other point in where Black Lives Matter has sort of surfaced in the wake of a particularly horrific killing. So I think that is a hopeful sign. And I think, the image that really spoke to me right after the murder of Philando Castile, and that is speaking to me again, is an icon, Our Lady Mother of Ferguson, which is a reinterpretation of a icon of Mary and Christ in her womb, where Mary's praying, her hands up in the Orans position is what it's called, praying position. And it's an image that the Our Lady Mother of Ferguson reinterprets that traditional image with a Black Madonna and a silhouetted child, hands up. Of course, in the praying position and the hands up, don't shoot position are quite similar to one another. The child in her womb has the sights of a gun trained on him, which of course is also the cross. And it's a powerful, I could go on talking about this image, but I won't. But I raise it to say what this image is a reminder of for me is the way Christ is always found in those that the world has declared marginal and is rejecting. I mean, that's Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. Whatever is done to the least of these sisters and brothers is done unto me. So when we, in our mercy for our children, try to cut them off from the suffering of the world, we also cut them off from Christ. Because that's where the face of Christ is. It's in those who are considered strangers, those who are in prison, those who are hungry, naked, unsheltered. And so if we as parents want our children to find Christ in the world, then we've got to give up these false notions of protecting them from suffering and mercy. We have to figure out how is it that we teach them to be faithful witnesses of the cross, like in multiple ways, right? Not the disciples who flee the cross, but the disciples who stay at the cross, John, Mary, and also witnesses of the cross in their own lives, in that inevitably standing at the foot of the cross means you're going to have a life where you bear witness to the cross yourself, or you bear witness to the sufferings of Christ. And I think it's just a reminder to me as a parent that my job is not to protect my child from suffering. My job is to teach my child how to suffer well and what she's not called to suffer, right? To learn to say the yeses and nos to suffering. That as a female, as you pointed out, like to teach my child to say only yes to suffering is then to sort of teach my child to submit to potentially abusive relationships, to teach my child to uphold a system of patriarchy. I don't want those kinds of yeses. And yet I don't want the kind of no's to suffering that end up sort of just ensconcing her in her own privilege. And so how do I say the yeses and no's to suffering? And it's very difficult right now because we are, a lot of us, living in actual bubbles, right? So I can narrate to my children what's happening. But like their world is literally the world of the house right now. They haven't been with friends or played with friends or been out into the world in a really long time. And so it's this very strange performative contradiction of like, what I don't want for my child is to live in a bubble. But right now, actually, my child does need to live in a bubble. And so how do I negotiate that at this moment of pandemic and coming to terms with the violence against Black bodies?
So if I could just follow up on that with Chris and Natalie and Jamie to some extent, like, here I have a 10-year-old and a 9-year-old. I have a 9-year-old who has been poised for the past. He handled this all very, very well for a long time, and now it's like I feel the pressure of him not being around other kids. Like I'm feeling it. I know he's feeling it to some extent, but there's the temptation to just give them everything you can to placate them and to just keep their minds off of what they miss. And then there's the damage that does, right? The idea of suffering well. It's like, how do you allow a 9 or a 10-year-old to suffer well and suffer creatively when they only have the capacity to suffer in a few ways, to express their suffering in a few ways?
Yeah.
Love to hear both of you talk about that for a minute.
It's pretty daunting because I feel like a lot of Christian parents are getting exactly kind of what they thought they wanted. That's why a lot of people homeschool and send to private school, and like they want to control and to bubble wrap their kids, in some ways. And now that many of us are getting it, even if we didn't opt for it, we're realizing, like what you said, the directive of Matthew 25, that Christ's presence comes to us through these external inputs in our lives, that if we lose that sort of permeability, we actually substantially lose the connection and contact with Christ. So that's pretty scary, but at the same time, Christ is going to subvert that every single time by being in the midst of 2 or more who gather in his name, and so, and going through locked doors, with a resurrected body that is somehow wounded but healed, and so I don't know. This is the stuff of parenting and discipleship, and I'm kind of encouraged that even by the dual meaning, at least in our language from the Latin, of confession, in that it is confessing sin and fallen shortness, and it is confessing in a more like proactive, confessing a faith that is maybe not even ours to claim. So that feels like wake up, confess, rinse, repeat, sort of thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, part of the importance is being able to allow your children to name their suffering as suffering, and to face it, not to try to flee from it or pretend it's not there, but to be able to name those losses and validate those feelings of suffering rather than drown them in distractions. And then the other thing I found is, one of my children is my most social child, is particularly not doing well. And I've realized what I need to do is set aside more one-on-one time with her for connection. And I don't think that you can spoil your children with connection. I think that's impossible. So, making those priorities of like, even though I feel like I'm with my children all the time right now, to be able to set aside more time as just quality time to pour into them, because they're not getting the other kinds of connections that they need. So for me, like the important thing to avoid are forms of suffering denial that end up preventing them from being able to really name and describe and move through what it is that they're feeling.
This is maybe going back a little bit. I thought that chapter was so remarkable, and it's an important reminder that gender is still such a significant factor as we're talking about this. So mostly in these conversations, I feel like white men we almost don't have the standing to epistemically access to, I think we just have to be honest that only Natalie could have written a chapter like that on Augustine. I never could have. I never could have. Absolutely impossible. I've been reading over and over during the pandemic Baldwin's. It's not as well known. No Name in the Street. Later sort of memoir, and in there's this incredible passage where he just points out the sense in which, because of the way Black Americans inhabit our society, they actually know way more than the people who have the privileged white people who have education, because they actually know both sides of the story and they know how to manage both things. And I think that's equally true for women in our society, right? And what worries me is the way US Christians, and especially evangelicals, love to fetishize their supposed suffering. Do you know what I mean? So like I think it was Christian Smith, when he was still at UNC, wrote a history of evangelicalism that was entitled Embattled But Thriving. And there's a whole industry of basically a bunch of white men who think they are terribly persecuted and suffer. And it's just bullshit. I mean, it's just absolute made up fiction, because what it means is somebody's maybe cutting into the comfort and privilege that's not suffering. that's discipline. And I'm totally with everything that Natalie's saying. And then I think for those of us who are men, for those of us who have this kind of privilege, it's mostly about what does it look like to lead maybe our sons in particular to places where they realize this is not suffering for you. This is discipline. This is actually learning the porosity of life. It's framing it in that way. That way, we don't get to assume the mantle of suffering so easily or comfortably.
I just wanted to add that I actually didn't feel entirely comfortable writing that chapter myself. I mean, as a white woman, I recognize I'm white, middle class, I'm privileged in all kinds of ways.
Sure.
And I realize all the ways that my attempts to wrestle through suffering in this world are clumsy and inflected by white privilege and not there yet. But I feel like I needed to be honest about what the struggle was. And I am committed to, I think the only way we move beyond the myopia of our privilege is by being in conversation with and going with life through people who are not privileged in the same ways that we are. So I've even lately trying to be more and more conscious of reading literature by Black writers and other people of color, because I recognize I'm still so myopic. And I'm sure if there were, I'm sure a person who has lived through much less privileged realities than I would read it and possibly be very turned off by my chapter. But so I don't present it as like a, look at me, I'm doing this so well. I don't think that I'm doing it well necessarily. I mean, I'm not, but I'm trying to find better ways of moving through suffering in the world.
Yeah. And I mean, I thought you indicate as much in the chapter. I think it was just a powerful reality. I was reading it in light of Me Too, and remember painful conversations with my wife, even that occasioned, and what it was to try. We're really talking about epistemic standpoint, right? Like what are the possibilities of getting to a place where you could understand something that could never actually be your story. And I think all writing is predicated on that. I think it's really, really important that we don't imagine just a complete siloization such that experience can only be the province of someone who has had a history. Otherwise, Baldwin wouldn't have written, and that's not, but there is something about then standpoint granting an access that the best writing is then inviting somebody to get some intimation of, even though it can never be identical. And on the treatment of and the risk to women, I think that's really important, especially given Augustine's legacy, as you rightly point out.
How long will evil men drag me down? Oh For God alone, 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 my soul in silence waits.
You kind of move the Confessions narrative towards memory, and you've written a lot on memory and images and iconoclasm and iconophilia. Again, revisiting some of that, parts of your book and also articles that you've written on that, really hits differently these days when so many of our public icons and statues and the memories around them are very much being interrogated and revisited. I just would love to hear a little bit. I mean, you wrote a whole book on it. I don't expect you to get us all the way there, but a little bit about that project and some of the insights that even make their way into this book.
Yeah. I'm interested in the ways that both image breaking and image making are both sort of coterminous with Christianity. We never sort of let go of our desire to make images and our constant making of images in Christianity, nor do we ever fully let go of our anxieties about images. So I was sort of interested in exploring that in my book, Image and Presence. And it's led me to an exploration of iconoclasm is sort of where my book ends. It runs through it, but I'm especially interested in iconoclasm for the end of the book. And I've thought about it, of course, at many points during the various controversies that have broken out in the last few years over Confederate statues, both in the way, in the kinds of questions that I guess I would put to it. There's this, I think that the public monuments like Confederate statues, it's interesting to watch them come down, right? Because one of the things that's interesting is how easily they come down. They're hollow. They're not well made. They come down not because they were memorializing this great particular person, but they were made in order to police and enforce a kind of supremacy of a kind of white supremacy regime of white supremacy. And now we're in a stage where there's other kinds of statues that are also people are raising questions about those. And I guess I would say, one of the things I've learned about iconoclasm is that there is a kind of energy to it that doesn't end. So this professor at Harvard, James Simpson, he wrote this book called Under the Hammer, where he's exploring iconoclasm in the Anglo-American tradition and the ways that it moves from a kind of breaking of images, like physical images, material images, into a kind of conceptual iconoclasm, to the modes of like academic arguments of critique and things that became really important to modern scholarship, honestly. And anyway, he has this phrase, that there's a kinesis to iconoclasm, that it doesn't provide its own end, that it can be funded by a kind of purity. And I think that's important background to keep in mind, to think what do we want our iconoclasm to do and where is it going? And to recognize that in as much as there's a kind of pure space, a kind of empty space of no, of free of corruption that is motivating it, that's going to be, number one, it's going to be a fantasy, because even in our iconoclastic acts, we're always replacing them with other images. So in Durham a few years ago, there was the tearing down of one of these Confederate soldiers. And what's so fascinating is that it was important to, people went and then took selfies with the fallen Confederate statue and took videos of it. And these images of the statue coming down were proliferated as kind of the new images that tell us who we are. We can't get away from making images. So I think we need to be aware of that, I guess. And the question is, what kind of images do we want to make? And so I think we need to ask, as we think about images and the way they function, what kind of image is this? The way a public monument functions to make present a certain political regime is different than a statue in a museum, for example. So that question needs to be asked. And then the second the question is, what kind of presence is this image sort of unleashing into the world? And the way that these Confederate statues were made just to enforce a kind of Jim Crow, segregationist, white supremacist world is important to thinking about their place in our world today. And the third question is, what kind of iconoclasm is the best way to address these statues? And I'm interested in the way that there's this traditional iconoclasm, this kind of iconoclasm of tearing down, which turns into this iconoclasm of unmasking in our critical discourses. But there's also these other kind of additive iconoclasms where you reframe the image by giving it a new meaning. So there was one sort of civil rights leader who was asked, so is it time for Stone Mountain, this sort of Confederate monument of like Mount Rushmore type of monument around Atlanta? Is it time for this to come down? And he was like, well, you know, what I would do is I would place a Liberty Bell in recognition of Martin Luther King's statement, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain. And what that does, he felt like, is it shows our commitment to liberty reaching even the most racist and unfree parts of our nation, rather than pretending like they aren't there by eradicating it. I don't know that that's the right solution for every Confederate monument, but I thought that that's an interesting way of performing an act of iconoclasm. It's breaking open this image and what it means, giving it a new meaning. That's not an actual physical tearing down. And as we move into new phases of iconoclasm, as we come to terms with things like George Washington was a slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson is a slaveholder, what kind of monuments can we allow for these people? Do we want to tear down all of these monuments? Do we want to find new forms of iconoclasm that instead reframe their meaning so that the kinds of presences they release into the world are not presences of white supremacy? So,
I love the idea that how these monuments are being taken down matters, because I think of like Duke Chapel for years strangely had a Robert E. Lee in the front of it, right next to John Wesley and Martin Luther. And then in the previous kind of season of iconoclasm, you know, they kind of roped it off, guarded it, and then one night, gone, never to have returned. There's an empty space which in itself is kind of powerful, but also the like kind of bureaucratic, technocratic, like quiet institutional way of removing that, rather than like crowds toppling. It's pretty significantly different, and certainly plays into the collective memory of that. Natalie, I was in Durham when they took that previous statue down, and that day was wild.
yeah.
Like, I remember just being so scared of what was going to happen to our city, because there was just it was a powder keg, and that day it felt like, especially, and this is again part of memory, that day ended after that monument toppled, and I give a lot of credit to our police and sheriff who gave space for those things to happen without escalating. It ended as a block party in a very Durham way. You've spent enough time in Durham to know, like, Durham mostly just wants to have a good time and cooperate and collaborate, mostly. And then, and so this recent kind of heightened tension, it almost felt like Durham had already made that choice several years ago on how this was going to happen. And so rather than tearing things down, and to be sure, some of the greatest points of anxiety were already torn down, instead downtown shops boarded up windows and hired artists of color to make art downtown. So our whole downtown was was full of image making rather
That's
than
awesome.
image breaking, and so I'm seeing a lot of these dynamics in play, and for sure Durham is not the crown jewel, and we don't get it right all the time, but in that case I found that particularly beautiful.
Yeah, I love it when artistic energies are released in these acts of protest, because they help us imagine the world differently in these really powerful ways. I was actually just recently came across this article that Toni Morrison wrote for The Nation, where she says, sounds very timely now, "I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art." And I read that as I was after I knew I was going to be speaking with you all today, and it made me wonder how you all thought about this. Like, Bob, I'm curious for how you think about this as an artist, what it means to make art in a world that's bruised and bleeding, and what place do you see your art making take in the world?
Well, I think it's to put it in the AVIC context. We're about to release this Gleam album, and this will be our third one, and it's the first one in 12 years. And these have traditionally been just Scott and Seth, very quiet, and just really very personal EPs, not even full-length albums. Mm-hmm. This one was a little more expanded. I played on 3 songs. Mm-hmm. But what I noticed about this one, and I think this is the case with the new Avid songs, and even with recent Avid songs, to me, every song's a hymn. Mm. More so than when it was, 2006, 2007, when it was Pretty Girl from Here, song about a car, song about getting out and traveling, this and that. There, more and more, it becomes, as we move through and mortality, becomes a greater subject. And even with the social changes around us, for years, we would have never, a social issue would not have crept into a song. But if you think that the lyrics that Scott and Seth write are from a very personal first person perspective, when the tide of the social issue approaches the door of the home in North Carolina, that's when it becomes fair game as topic or background, or it takes a place. So I see that in a couple guys. I've always been a political junkie and a historical fiend. But for those guys to see it creep in here, and even the faith was always there, but it was, in the subconscious of the song, and it's kind of moving to the front. I've seen it creep to the front over the past 10 years. And I think now it's, I really sense that 90% of these songs are going to be hymns of one sort or another. And I feel like Victory, the recent release, it's a hymn. So there's that. And then as far as statues go, and I've given a lot of thought to this, George Washington in particular. I did take an early American writings class, and I read the book about Ona Judge, who was the slave that Washington, the enslaved woman who was owned by Washington, and she escaped. And he used he used a lot of money, and he used his political power and his prestige as George Washington while president to subvert his own laws, the laws of the United States, to get her back. And we would say he was guilty of obstruction of justice today. He would be, that's how we would approach this, and we would look at the situation. He never got her back. And in fact, as we became more partisan during his presidency, the nation became more partisan, and that's where the parties began to develop while he was a unifying figure. As his presidency moved forward, we became more partisan, and the people that would have aided him at one point in getting her back were like, hey, you know, they were more like less willing to do his bidding because the nation was becoming more partisan. So, but at the same time with Washington, he relinquished power after his second term willingly. I mean, he did it. He wanted to do it. He was done with it, the presidency. He could have been a king if he chose. He could have had probably several more terms, could have served out the rest of his life. And if he had done so, that would have been the precedent, right? Because he set all the precedents for the executive branch and for the presidency. And so by relinquishing power, he gave the words of the Declaration of Independence. He gave the gold to, he gave the cash that backs up the gold, right? He began to give those words of the Declaration of Independence, which were always aspirational words. He began to give them reality and heft, right? And so that is, Washington was probably single-handedly responsible for the democracy that we live in today. His act as president, the precedents he set, his warning, his farewell address, his warning of foreign entanglements, his warnings about parties and partisanship. So we need to keep, again, just like joy and suffering are the two sides of the same coin. Well, Washington has two sides, and those two sides are our nation, right? There is the sin of slavery, the original sin of slavery, and the aspiration of democracy and equality. And so we have been wrestling with those for 240 years, I think, 240 years. And the beauty of the United States and our democracy is, though we rarely get it right, when we have gotten it right, we really get it right. And the aspiration that we'll always get it better. And so when you talk about George Washington, it's different than talking about Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson. So my hope is that we would be more stoic about our heroes, right? Not put them literally on a pedestal and research them and read about them, right? But what you say with iconoclasm, we can't help it. We can't help it. We got to build monuments. We got to build statues. So the idea is to, like you say, I think Stone Mountain, that's a great example. Give it context. Put the Liberty Bell, and Martin Luther King's words alongside the Confederacy, and you take the power out of the Confederacy, and you give us to understand. We had an album a couple years ago, True Sadness, and I don't ever do this. Put a lot of context. Put things in the context of the Avett Brothers. I'm sorry to do that. But,
I did it to you.
But the whole concept of that record is that we walk through our lives holding in our hearts this immense pain and this immense joy at the same time. And so just like we do as individuals, our nation, we walk around with the hope of equality and this idea that we can do better and that we can be better. And then on the other hand, it's like, man, we suck. We've always sucked, So that's I guess that's the way I kind of look at this moment in time.
Yeah, I think of We Americans on the last album, which is because it speaks to this idea of monuments and our image making. Blood on the table with the coffee and the sugar, right? So that to me, it's a remarkable meditation on the way history never leaves us, right? It's never past the Faulkner point. And it strikes me that this directly bears on the monuments conversation, which is, I actually think ruined monuments are themselves honest about a history, even as they're aspiring to something forward, right? The defaced monument might be a more powerful image for people to move by than the blank space. One of the things that worries me about are sometimes the way we talk about revolutionary tendencies today is the great failure of the French Revolution, I think, as a spirit, was that it imagined you could start with this blank check, right? Like you could just sort of efface history, and you could change how many days were in a week, and all these. And that's the last thing Americans need right now, because we are prone to just imagine we can triumph over our history. What we need is art that laments, which is that dance of, on the one hand, recognizing and seeing the brokenness and naming it and dwelling with it, but then that chord of hope that always suffuses the lament psalm. I think that's some of the most powerful art that we'll see come from this moment.
Can I just say on We Americans, Jamie, and this is something that is just has stood out from the first time I heard the song. The song, the last verse, the end of the song, it's about coming together with God.
Yeah,
it transcends government and partisanship and the sins of slavery. It's really, again, getting back to the hymn.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Here you have, hey, if you're not happy that we have a song that has political overtones, man, you're really not going to be happy that we have a song that takes political nationalistic ideas and wraps them in the cross, but in the opposite way of how that's typically done.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't even know if Seth's aware that he did that. Yeah.
I guess people have to be attuned to hear it, perhaps, because you could not. Yeah. But it's clear. And it's confession. It's in the moment of confession too, right? It's like, I don't know. We don't know. We don't know, but we're hoping. And posture of hope is different than that is a countercultural reality. I do think it's because hope is actually a posture that recognizes the limits of our own capacity. And I think we do live in a cultural moment that in weird ways is still a little overconfident in what we can accomplish. But I wouldn't belabor that point, but I do think it's worth keeping on the table.
I think also, just to bring it back, like to draw the two conversations together, confession is this iconoclastic moment, right, where you're confessing your own brokenness, and also that you're not who you present yourself to be, who you narrate yourself to be. And at the same time, it's a moment where you receive yourself anew, a new kind of wholeness. And I think that's the same kind of thing that we need now with our monuments. Like, we need iconoclastic artists who maybe will be involved in these acts of destruction that become new acts of creation, or maybe will be involved in sort of additive acts of creation that end up also being acts of destroying further meanings. And I think that would be really interesting to see I know everyone's pandemic focused right at this moment, but if we can get to a place where cities are really willing to invest in reimagining their history by bringing artists to help reconstruct the monuments that are telling us who we are and who we aspire to be in the world.
Yeah. With the palimpsest of history there still as reminder, but the creativity of that rather than, I think that's exactly right. It reminds me of the wrapped Reichstag. I can't remember if you talk about that in your book or not, Natalie, but that was an act of Germany sort of grappling with that history in a very aesthetic, image-based way.
Jamie, I think back to the beginning of Desiring the Kingdom and like the exercise that you put the readers through of being, an alien, examining this
at the mall.
This worship space, which winds up being a shopping mall, and when it, because you see the performance of worship and of idolatry and of in these lives that these images signal, kind of like when Bob was talking about Washington, I was thinking about saints and hagiography, and so maybe that's a sort of kind of imaginative exercise for the reconfiguring of these images and monuments is to somehow have new eyes, and maybe these new eyes come from the least of these, and those who haven't previously had voice. They've always had eyes, but they've never had a voice to contribute to that conversation about what they're seeing when they see these, and who we are because of these images. Yeah,
it's very interesting. This I hope this a detour, but just as a brief aside, I think the presence of the African American History Museum, where it is on the National Mall, and its architectural signals, it is a certain refusal of the bullshit classicism that sort of dominates Washington.
And Phil Freelon is from Durham, North Carolina.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. And I mean, it's almost like to go through the harrowing experience of the African American History Museum, and then to walk out onto the mall and to see the Washington Monument completely recontextualizes the entire idolatry of the National Mall. And I think it's a very, very powerful performance of what we're talking about.
Jamie, you talked about this male victimization, I guess, self-victimization. The idea that if someone else is getting something, I'm getting less.
Yeah.
Would you put it that way? Kind of.
Yeah. I mean, that's right. It's a logic of scarcity.
Right. So that is what we are living in. That is also a part of this conversation about iconoclasm. It's a part of the conversation about motherhood. It's part of the conversation about your book. It's like the idea of we're figuring out, the four of us are talking about all these great ways to address this, but there's another factor out there. There's a 50% of the country who are white males, and maybe they're 40%, maybe there's more women than men out there today, but that they've got something to say about it too. And that's where the conflict is going to be. And that's how this battle will go on. And people are going to continue to read St. Augustine as well in the Confessions, and it'll continue to be interpreted and reinterpreted long past our time.
Well, I hope they need to issue it as a 2-volume set, the Confessions and
I think we lost him. I think he said
we did.
Motherhood.
He's frozen in
he
time.
He definitely said Motherhood and not his own book.
Well, Natalie and Jamie, it was incredible to have you guys here. We hope to have you both back again. This has been a dream for Chris and I, and we wish you the best of luck moving forward.
In the steadfast love of the Lord, from everlasting to everlasting, the steadfast love of the Lord, from everlasting to everlasting, the steadfast love of the Lord, from everlasting to everlasting, the steadfast love of the Lord, from everlasting to everlasting. And as high as the heavens are up above, so is the greatness of his love. As far as the east is from the west, he removes our sin from us. Far as the east is from the west, far as the east is from the west, far as the east is from the west, far as the east is from the west.
You just spent more than an hour of your day listening to this conversation, and for that we're grateful. We'd love to continue the conversation by social media, so you can contact us at Bob Crawford Base, at RevBrez, or through the show's social media at RTN Theology. We'd love to hear the ways that you're experiencing these conversations, the ways that you're sharing them and sparking new conversations, the ways that you're building community, and any ideas you might have for future guests or topics. If you enjoyed this episode of RTN Theology, you also might enjoy going back through the archives and giving some of the old episodes a listen, like episode 11 with Stanley Hauerwas writing to his godchild about virtue, or episode 13 with Jennifer Allen Kraft as she talks about art and placemaking, or episode 19, a listener favorite, also with Jamie Smith, about his book on St. Augustine. As always, today's episode is co-hosted and co-produced by Bob Crawford and Chris Breslin, and edited by me, Chris Breslin. Special music for this episode comes from Paul Zock featuring Liz Weiss from the EP God is the Friend of Silence. You heard East and West, Restore Us, O Lord, I'll Never Leave You Alone, and For God Alone. Support Paul in the work that he's doing in Richmond. He collaborates with the Porter's Gate Worship Project and always has something good going on. You can find him on his website, Bandcamp, and Spotify.
Our intro music is A.A. Gray and 7 Foot Dilly, The Old Arcs A-Movin', and we love to end our show with David Childers' Jesus Said. Please remember to rate us on iTunes and write a review, subscribe to our podcast, and follow us on socials, and please, please, please share this episode with a friend. Until next time, take care.